Okay, people, I think we might as well start. It's gone 8 o'clock. So welcome to the Philosophy Society. Today, I'm afraid we've had this rather mingy venue because load shedding was predicted, even though it didn't arrive. So what we'll do this time is remain here for both drinks and conversation afterwards. We won't be going anywhere, okay? I've brought some accoutrements with me, and not very beautiful ones, but they'll do. So without further ado, we've got Ole Mogomotsi, our very own colleague, and he's going to talk today about, the official title was You Don't Believe You're Incompetent, the imposter phenomenon. Okay? Yes. Over to you, Ole.
All right, thank you everyone for, it should be on. Thank you all for braving the storms today. I'm going to be talking about something called the imposter phenomenon. However, some of you are more familiar with it as the imposter syndrome, right? And hopefully I'll get to explain why I chose the term, or I'm more for the term imposter phenomenon as you kind of get through the presentation. But for the most part, this is something that I think we all experience, right? I just wanted to check in the room who has experienced it before. Me, thank you, great. Okay, well, not so great actually. But nonetheless, I thought because it's something that we tend to all experience, it's something that we need to know a little bit more about, right? And there are these kind of running definitions of this term, psychological running definitions of the imposter phenomenon, right? And it has those kind of definitions have bothered epistemologists, at least recently. So I'm an epistemologist by night, a Hegelian by day, so just so you know, okay? So these things kind of fascinate me. I'm interested in what other ways does the imposter phenomenon manifest itself, right? So effectively, what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be introducing the imposter phenomenon, or at least what I will be calling impostorism afterwards, okay? Afterwards, I'll be honing down on the key components of what impostorism involves. So I'll be saying that there are 4 components to impostorism, which we'll get to shortly. And then I'm going to look at the kind of accounts that epistemologists give about impostorism, right? And I say these are doxastic accounts, so that's kind of a big word for some, but nonetheless, it's basically accounts that involve belief, right? So these kind of accounts will say that having imposter syndrome or impostorism is a form of having a belief about yourself, right? So effectively, I am a little bit ambivalent about whether having imposter syndrome involves having a belief that you are incompetent, right? And hopefully I'll be able to convince you why not all cases of impostorism necessarily involve having a belief in being incompetent. Hence the title, You Don't Believe You're Incompetent, even though you might still have imposter syndrome. That's effectively what I want to be saying, okay? So, given that I'm a bit ambivalent, or I'm a bit like, I'm neutral on whether impostorism involves belief, right? I'm going to be presenting 3 accounts of my own, hopefully if we have more time, right? If we have time, we'll deal with all 3, but I want to focus mainly on 2. So I'm going to be proposing my own 2 accounts of 3 of impostorism, right? That effectively are what we call non-doxastic accounts. They involve understanding impostorism as a kind of attitude that perhaps looks like a belief, but it actually isn't, okay? So that's effectively what I'm going to be saying. The first account that I'm going to look at is the ambivalence account. I called it the self-doubt account, self-skepticism account, whatever. I just stuck with ambivalence because I feel like it's a buzzword for me lately, okay? And then the second account is going to be the A-leaf account. So some of you might not be familiar with what an A-leaf is. An A-leaf is something that's meant to be a contrast to a B-leaf, which is what you already know, right? So we'll just look at how can we cast impostorism as a potential A-leaf, okay? And then the last thing we're going to look at is whether we can think of impostorism as a kind of intrusive thought, right? And my claim again is that intrusive thoughts are also not something that qualifies to be a belief. So that might be another potential non-doxastic account of impostorism, okay? So in terms of how impostorism comes, or imposter syndrome comes into play in our, modern day lexicon of language, right? It was developed by these 2 psychologists called Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, right? So they wrote this book called The Imposter Phenomenon. Effectively, they were the first to bring about this very systematic psychological study of imposter syndrome, right? And their study effectively only focused on the fears that women in cognate fields, like academia and so forth, the kind of fears that they had about themselves potentially not being successful or not having what it takes to be in that field, right? And the kind of things that they pointed out were, there were some things that perhaps happened in one's childhood, like maybe they didn't get enough attention or they got too much attention, those kind of things that psychologists tend to pick up to effectively explain why you are predisposed to having these attitudes about yourself, these negative attitudes about yourself as being potentially incompetent, right? So they list other things like if you're more prone to anxiety, you're more prone to being, to having imposter attitudes and so forth, right? So they'll effectively list all these factors and say that, all these things contribute to people developing these attitudes that they might be incompetent when they actually are not, okay? So effectively, the way in which they defined impostorism was to say that impostorism involves individuals who falsely feel or self-appraise themselves as being incompetent or frauds, despite having evidence to the contrary. They must have evidence to the contrary, right? So the many of us who have raised our hands, if according to this definition, right, we feel or we doubt ourselves effectively. We think that we self-appraise rather as individuals who are incompetent. And effectively that self-appraising has to be something that's incorrect because the evidence that you actually have in front of you says something different, right? So effectively, the kind of people that have raised their hands are people who are in university, people who have managed to get into UCT, people who work at UCT, people who have published greatly and so forth, right? But for some reason, these individuals who tend to have this mountain of evidence in front of them that they are in fact competent are still prone to developing these attitudes, right? That something in my mind tells me or makes me doubt whether I am actually competent or whether I actually belong to this epistemic circle that we find ourselves in. So the other thing to note is they, of course, think that, and I agree with this too, they think that, of course, everyone experiences imposter syndrome, right? However, there are some who are especially prone to experiencing it, particularly given to certain factors about their identity that make them particularly prone to experiencing it, right? So I list there again marginalized groups as being one of the people who are specifically more likely to develop impostorism. This is something that I think multiple studies are showing. I've just listed two here. With Clowns and Eames' own study displays that. Ebony et al. Also displays that, but I don't want to go too much into that, right? But effectively, people who encounter things like stereotype threats and are subject to historical discrimination in particular cognate fields, for example, are more likely to think that they don't belong in those fields, or they're more likely to feel that they do not have what it takes to be in that field because of the kind of biases that are working against them, okay? So even from this, the study already, right, there has been significant resistance to syndromizing, as I say, impostorism, right? Because the problem with syndromizing it is that it somewhat assumes that the problem is internal to the agent, right? There's something that goes wrong in the agent that results in that agent developing these imposter attitudes, right? There's also this implication that there's some sort of psychological breakdown that directly contributes or is the only explanatory factor in why someone has imposter attitudes, right? So there's this resistance to syndromizing it in the clinical sense because we want to be able to say there's more to impostorism than just potential psychological breakdowns in cognition and so forth, right? So effectively, I'm being guided by this need to stop syndromizing, effectively, to find ways, different pathways in which we can understand what impostorism entails, okay? So I said that impostorism has four key components for me, according to me anyway, right? So the first thing it involves some form of distressing attitude towards yourself or your skills, abilities, right? Or even your success, or like a negative relation to your success, right? It involves this kind of preposition that I am or might not be good enough, right? As soon as you entertain that preposition in your head, or that statement in your head, that I am not good enough, or I might not be good enough, right? That's where effectively impostorism starts coming in, right? Because effectively you think that you do not have what it takes, or you might be a fraud, or you might be pretending that you are good enough when in actuality you aren't, right? That's the kind of thinking that you end up entertaining. The other thing is that for something to count as impostorism, it has to be distressing to the agent experiencing it, right? There has to be some level where the agent has some sort of fear that they might be exposed, right, as an imposter, or like as a fraud in this instance, right? There has to be an anxious relation to your self-appraisal. So what I mean by that is you have to be anxious effectively about how you view yourself as an epistemic agent, effectively, like how good are you of an epistemic agent, right? And we like to say that, I like to think that impostorism also involves things like a lack of self-confidence in your ability as an epistemic agent, right? Or an element of self-doubt, induced however how, but at least those kind of feelings have to be there, right? So the other thing is, there must be a track of evidence that points to the victim, the impostorism victim's ability, right? There has to be evidence that this person is in fact good enough, right? Why is that the case? Because if there is absolutely no evidence that you're good enough, then you probably are an imposter, right? Effectively, just to put it blindly, right? So this can go two ways. It could be that, the other thing I wanted to say is that either there has to be evidence that this individual is successful, right? There has to be clear evidence that this individual is successful, or this individual must at least meet the minimum standards of what's required at their level, right? If you want to say that. So, for example, a university student has certain standards that they have to meet in order to be considered an adequate university student, right? They don't have to necessarily have all these accolades and so forth in order to prove themselves as worthy, right? They just need to meet those minimum standards, so to speak, right? So you can think about it in that way. So if someone doesn't meet the minimum standards, right, they're probably an impostoring university student, right? But then if they meet those standards but they still develop these attitudes, then we're saying that that individual is in fact experiencing impostorism, right? Because they're experiencing an attitude that does not match up with the actual evidence, effectively, okay? And this is what I mean by imposter attitudes necessarily have to be false. They are effectively what I'll show in dealing with the A-leaf account, right, is that imposter attitudes have to be reality insensitive in some way. That's the term I'm going to be using later, right? So again, they have to in some way go against the evidence that one has available to them. Okay, cool. All right, so at least I'm thinking that a promising account of impostorism has to at least account for all these four components. And hopefully the ones that I'm going to be presenting to you do account for all these components. So right now I think I've been discussing impostorism much more as a general psychological phenomenon, so I just want to hone it back into the space of epistemology, right? How can we think of these imposter attitudes as epistemic phenomena? Okay. So the one thing we can think of is impostorism directly implicates or concerns how you think of yourself as a knower, right? Effectively, it involves a negative attitude towards your own capacity as a knower or being in the knower, right? So we say that if I have imposter syndrome, I think that I'm not a good enough knower or I'm not in the know enough and so forth, right? There's this kind of direct relationship to your status as a knower, okay? Another thing is that impostorism, for me, implicates something we call epistemic self-trust, right? So Linda Zesby, whatever, hate the surname, I always have to say it. But nonetheless, Linda Zesby states that epistemic self-trust involves one's self-confidence in one's ability to contribute and adequately participate in the epistemic community, right? So again, if you don't think that you are able enough or capable enough to contribute to epistemic community, right? Or adequately skilled enough to participate in your epistemic community, you're likely to be an individual who experiences impostorism in that community. So the other thing is, it involves how you see yourself as an epistemic peer, right? So epistemic peers are effectively people who are on par with you, epistemically speaking, effectively. People who know it the same as you, people who are beholden to the same standards as you, epistemically speaking, right? So if you see yourself as falling short of the rest of your epistemic peers, you're likely to be one who experiences impostorism, especially if you don't actually fall short, especially if you do actually meet the standards required. So I say here that we need to be open, effectively, to the fact that impostorism concerns some form of attitude, right? And this attitude or mental state is towards particularly this preposition that how you relate to this preposition of I am competent. So you could relate negatively saying that I'm not competent or I am competent, right? So my point is that this attitude could be doxastic or non-doxastic. It could involve belief or couldn't. It doesn't have to involve belief, right? So, as I'll show just now, some epistemologists obviously go straight in and say that imposter attitudes only involve belief, right? You have to believe that you are incompetent in order to have imposter attitudes. So I'm saying that, well, don't have to believe that you are incompetent, and you can still develop impostorism effectively. You can still have imposter attitudes without having to believe that you are an imposter. Okay. So let's look at the two doxastic accounts, or the two belief accounts that are a little bit popular, and we're going to look at what maybe some issues I have with them. So that's a very nice picture of Stephen Gadsby, right? It's a poet, I think some Nordic researcher, right? And he gives what we call a motivational account of impostorism, right? So I particularly don't like this account. Hopefully you get to see why. But effectively he says that there are three central components to having imposter attitudes, or to experiencing impostorism, right? I'm trying my best not to say imposter syndrome, but nonetheless. In experiencing impostorism, right? You must have an unjustified belief. That's the first component. You must biasly treat evidence available to you. That's the second component. And he thinks that all imposter attitudes have motivational benefits, which seems strange to us, and I want to at least say that it is strange. Okay. So he says that based on how the impostorism experiencer treats evidence in front of them, the positive evidence in front of them, they must have an unwarranted belief. They must hold it to be true in an unwarranted way, that they are incompetent, right? So effectively, because you tend to dismiss evidence that clearly speaks to your ability, according to him, right? You are unwarranted, or you have an unreasonable belief in your incompetence. And I'm stressing again belief in the sense that you hold it to be true, you accept that you are incompetent. You are committed effectively in some way, right? Because we like to think, at least in the traditional sense, that beliefs, at least dispositional beliefs or habitual beliefs, require you to have some sort of commitment to that particular statement you believe, right? So another way in which he explains this unjustified or unjustified nature of the belief is to say that we just have to look at the biased way in which these people treat the evidence, okay? So he says that imposter attitudes are effectively maintained through biased treatment against integrating any positive feedback, right? So effectively it goes something like this. If you're currently going through an episode of imposter attitudes, right? Someone comes to you and says, no, but you're good enough, like, you know, you just push through, you're gonna be okay. I know you got a certificate last week for something, right? And then you just say like, no, I don't care about that, right? So basically you're dismissing things that actively point towards the fact that you are competent. So effectively, because you biasly dismiss that evidence, he will say that you have an unwarranted or unjustified or unreasonable belief in your incompetence. Why does impostorism have motivational benefits according to him? Is because he thinks that people who experience impostorism tend to think that they need to work harder, right? They tend to think that they have to perform better than they currently do, right? So there's a motivational benefit in the sense that imposter sufferers tend to want to prove themselves as better than they actually are. So that is some sort of, in a weird way, a motivational benefit, right? Because you're motivated to do better if you experience impostorism relative to when you don't, okay? So there are a few things that I want to highlight here, one of them being, I find it a bit troubling that he thinks that imposter attitudes only involve unjustified belief, right? We like to at least think that it's possible for someone to, if we accept the belief account, like to think that it's at least possible for someone to have reason to doubt their abilities, right? Particularly if, let's say, you encounter some very, let's use something that perhaps some of us are all familiar with, right? All too familiar with. Getting a paper rejected in a journal, right? Whatever, from a journal, right? So that kind of thing is kind of here, we'll say, we would treat that as credible evidence, right, against one's ability, right? So kind of as receiving a rejection, as we would say, right, would be enough reason for you to readjust your current attitudes towards yourself and whether you're capable or not, right? So effectively what I'm highlighting is impostorism need not only involve unjustified belief. Some people can have justified reasons for why they think they're not good enough when they actually are, effectively, okay? Also, this motivational link that he's speaking about here, I think is a bit too indeterminate, right? Because we might think that it's as likely that someone might be completely despondent after experiencing impostorism, right? As it is for them to have to prove themselves. So there's a sense in which I don't think he makes a really good argument for there being motivational benefits to being an imposter or experiencing impostorism, right? Another thing is, if we think of impostorism as a belief, it becomes very difficult to explain how people who experience impostorism tend to be able to overcome or move past or be able to dismiss these feelings over time, right? So there are those, of course, who experience a chronic form of impostorism, right? Where literally every single day is a day where you feel like you're not competent, right? But then there are perhaps the milder cases where impostorism is something that ebbs and flows throughout your life, right? Depending on what you encounter, you tend to experience it at one point, and then a week later you're completely fine, you're able to do whatever you need to do, right? So if you are committed to your imposter attitudes in the form of a belief, if you really held it true, you were committed, you accepted that you were an imposter, it seems difficult then to explain how it is that you can move past that. You can move past these attitudes, right? Because we like to think beliefs are things you're committed to. So how is it possible that all of a sudden you can just, break past that belief and into feeling like you're competent again and so forth? So we need to be able to explain all these things. Okay. So someone who gives a better account, this is actually the individual who inspired me to look at this word, right? Is Catherine Hawley, right? So fortunately she passed away like 2 years ago, I think. Some of you might know, Tom, I don't know. Yeah, so it's it's a bittersweet thing also to be working on this, because I think she's really the principal philosopher who brought imposter attitudes into the conversation for epistemologists, right? So she has a better account, I think, where she divides her conception of impostorism into two. She says that there can be a narrow doxastic conception of impostorism and a broad doxastic account of impostorism, right? So in the narrow doxastic conception, individuals effectively falsely believe that they are incompetent despite having evidence to the contrary, right? So it's the kind of case that we already looked at, where effectively these individuals are unjustified and irrational in their belief because the evidentiary landscape clearly points to the fact that they are competent. So in this kind of narrow case, there are no impediments to you being able to find out whether something is, whether you are competent or not, right? But then you nonetheless develop that belief. So he would say that in that instance, it is unjustified and an irrational belief. And then the broad conception, right? Here is the kind of case that I was speaking about when I was critiquing Gatsby's account, that in this case, one is effectively justified for having an otherwise false belief, right? That they are incompetent, and effectively they are justified because the evidentiary landscape might be opaque enough for them to form this belief, right? So it's possible for them to be justified because they might end up encountering some sort of evidence or stereotype threats, as I put there, unnecessarily high standards, for example, right? All these kind of things might feed in such that they appear to be credible feedback that speaks to their ability as well, right? In addition to the feedback that they already have, which is positive, that they're good enough and so forth. So that kind of murky evidentiary landscape makes it such that they're justified in also forming what you call this, imposter attitudes. Okay. So the key thing before I move on is like, the question that I have is, does the imposter sufferer have to take it to be true that they are imposters in order to experience impostorism, right? That's another way of saying, do they have to believe that they're imposters in order to experience impostorism? So effectively, I'm going to be saying no to that statement and hopefully giving you different accounts. But let me speak briefly about why I'm also a little bit, on the fence about whether impostorism necessarily involves belief. So a few philosophers, of course, have spoken about this. They've been like, okay, at least Shanna Slag, Neil Levi, if you're familiar with them. They have also kind of voiced a form of like ambivalence, but in the papers that I've read, at least, they don't explain why they're ambivalent about it. They just say that, well, we're not sure whether impostorism necessarily involves belief, and they just leave it at that. Okay, so at least I'm like, okay, my opportunity come in. Maybe I can try and show how it doesn't involve belief. Okay. So another thing is, if we think that belief requires some acceptance, are resistant to change, require you to be committed, the fact that you can't hold contradictory beliefs together at the same time, like at least this is a traditionalist view, sorry everyone, if you don't agree. And if you think that belief has to accord with desire and intention and so forth, I'll get to that a bit more, then we might have reason to believe that some imposter attitudes are not beliefs. Okay? Why? Because, as I will show with my 3 accounts, some imposter attitudes seem to be random. They seem to come randomly, right? They seem to be associative in the sense that they seem to just be induced by something, right? Some phenomenon, right? They seem to be automatic, right? They don't necessarily, you don't go around looking to be an imposter and trying to, find out whether you are one. It's something that just comes to you, right? In that sense, at least how I experience it. So there's also a little bit of that phenomenological work happening. So mind you, if you don't experience the same things as I do, I'm sorry. Okay? But also we tend to think that imposter attitudes are things that are defeasible, right? They are defeasible because I can think ordinary cases where individuals do have imposter attitudes at the moment, but they're able to surpass them. Yes, they come back again later, but nonetheless, defeasibility is possible, at least in that moment, right? And they can dissipate over time as well. That's at least what I'm committed. Oh, I need water. I think the other thing that I was worried about with these doxastic accounts is they seem to be patronizing to the epistemic agent in some way, right? In the sense that I think they downplay the epistemic agent's ability to fully grasp the extent of their epistemic situation, right? Fully grasp the evidentiary landscape that's available to them, right? It seems strange to me to say that someone who experiences imposter syndrome completely ignores the fact that they are successful, that they are competent, right? that belief also all of a sudden stops coming into play at all once they attain these these imposter attitudes, right? So I think that there's something wrong with that kind of account. Okay. So I think it's more appropriate to say that on the whole or globally, right, an imposter attitude, an impostorism sufferer tends to believe that they are competent. However, they experience lapses of some sort, effectively, right, that make them momentarily think or have thoughts that they are incompetent. So I think that's a much more appropriate way to cast impostorism. Okay. And the last thing is, if we want to be committed to saying something like impostorism involves having feelings of self-doubt, wondering whether you are, and if it involves that kind of a question that disrupts the normality of your belief that you're competent, right? If it involves self-doubt, then we would have to think this to be antithetical or contradictory to taking it with certainty that you are an imposter. If you're experiencing self-doubt, you're not experiencing something like, I'm certain that I'm an imposter, right? Maybe you're experiencing something like, I might be an imposter. And that for me is enough to say that when you are questioning the otherwise normal state of you thinking you are competent, when you're engaged in that self-doubt, that's when you actually experience what I think is impostorism. Okay. Whew. Okay, let's look at my doxastic accounts. I know I have about 10 minutes, Tom, right? Okay. Let's look at them quickly. So the one thing I wanted to say is, I'm not saying that there are no cases that don't involve belief. That's not what I was saying. I was saying that they might be alternatives to the otherwise typical cases of belief, right? I also want to put a stronger claim that doxastic accounts, for me, focus more on the chronic cases of impostorism, right? For someone to believe that they're an imposter, for me, is a very extreme form of impostorism, right? Because they hold it to be true. Again, that's why perhaps they will be insensitive to evidence, as I think Hawley was pointing out, right? But I think that those are the more kind of extreme or chronic cases of impostorism, right? However, there are some people would say they experience functional impostorism, right? In the same way that they would say you have functional anxiety or whatever, right? Where it's possible for you to kind of, as I said, ebb and flow back into it and be able to escape it over time and so forth. So I want to be able to explain those kind of cases. Also, we need to explain how one can, on the whole, act successfully or dismiss imposter attitudes entirely, right? So again, this is very difficult if an agent is taken to believe that they're incompetent, right? Because how then are they able to move past that attitude effectively? So I'm thinking there are easier ways to explain that. So looking at the ambivalence account, right? I'm starting with effectively looking at what my assumptions of belief are, my traditional assumptions of what belief is, right? So I think that belief involves holding something to be true, that you can't believe contradictory things at the same time, right? That there has to be some element of certainty towards that proposition that you believe, right? Or you take it to be true. And this is the most controversial point, but nonetheless, belief also involves some sort of, it has to be concordant with some sort of desire and intention. So if you believe something, you're likelier if you believe P, you're likelier to desire P, and you're likelier to act in accordance with P, effectively, right? So for impostorism to be a doxastic state or a state that involves belief, it must at least accord with any of these, right? So effectively, I want to say that there are cases that don't accord with this, right? So the first account, which I call the ambivalence account, I effectively cast impostorism as an instance where one doubts or has an attitude of anxious ambivalence towards their own ability or status as an epistemic peer. Okay? So the reason why someone ends up experiencing this element of self-doubt is precisely because of the opaqueness of the evidentiary landscape, right? So effectively, there might be things in your environment that point to the truth, the potential truth rather, of the claim that you are incompetent, right? That exists alongside the claims that you already take to be true, which is that I am competent, right? And then that potential conflict, I claim that it brings about an element of ambivalence, which in and of itself produces imposter attitudes, right? And it produces this fear that I might not be good enough, effectively, okay? So, effectively also when one's environment produces negative feedback, which is either false, sometimes because of epistemic injustice, people tend to get feedback which is not true, right? If the negative feedback is in some sense overdetermined, so by this I mean you overdetermine the importance, of the feedback, right? So for example, if you get a rejection from a journal, right? When you overdetermine that feedback, you almost throw it out of proportion as if it's not part of being an academic, right? It's just part of what we do. Sometimes you're gonna get rejected. Doesn't mean that you are incompetent, right? Effectively. But the point is that negative feedback creates some sort of confusion between what I think appear to us as potentially two possible truths, effectively, right? And it's that tension between these possible truths which induces self-doubt, okay? So just to make it a bit more clear, right? The ambivalence account says impostorism involves having a general belief, right, that you are competent, right, which periodically conflicts with a negative belief-like attitude state, right, or state, which effectively results in self-doubt because of that conflict, effectively. So I think that imposter attitudes reside in you calling into question whether you're competent, right? It's not a belief that you are competent. It resides rather in having the potential thought that you might be incompetent, right? So I think that the distress, also the anxiety that one experiences is as a result of that kind of uncertainty or that kind of doubt that one experiences, right? So effectively on this account, it is possible that one can believe globally on the whole that they're competent, right? But momentarily experience ambivalence when encountering overall perhaps false or irrelevant, but reliable looking evidence effectively. So yeah, I've already covered that for the interest of time. But I'm thinking that this account also avoids the issues that I saw earlier, which is that it avoids us patronizing the epistemic agent, because it allows us to say that an epistemic agent can be very aware of the kind of evidentiary landscape they find themselves in, be able to consider the fact that there's always positive evidence there, speaking to their abilities, but nonetheless experience this thing called impostorism. Why? Because they have moments where they do experience some negative feedback, which perhaps tries to tip the balance for them, but then ultimately doesn't work out, because obviously the belief wins, and also the evidence speaks for itself effectively. Right? I'm trying to move on because I think I've spoken about this. Yeah, I think I've spoken about this. Let me move on to what's more exciting and then I'll stop. Sorry, if you want to know more about intrusive thoughts, I can talk about that. So the last one, which I think is I'm more excited about, is the A-leaf account of impostorism, right? So this was developed by Tamar Gendler, sorry, I always want to say Glenda, but nonetheless, who effectively developed this concept of A-leaf in contrast to something called a B-leaf. So I'm using her A-leaf account to explain how impostorism can be an A-leaf, right? So the way in which she explains A-leaf is that imagine you're entertaining walking on a glass skywalk, right? I think there's one in China like hundreds of meters up, right? And you see all these signs, you've researched it already, and you know, like you've established that this thing is structurally sound. It has all these awards saying #1 most structurally sound bridge, right, on Earth, okay? So effectively, after a research, we can say that you obviously believe, you can hold it to be true that this bridge is stable, right? But the moment you start walking on it, you get this, almost immediate automatic shock that glass breaks, caution, you might die, it might collapse, whatever, right? Kind of like a thought that just comes into your head. Now, what happens to you is that also adjusts the way you act, right, in that situation. You end up like shaking, effectively, right? Because you're like, oh my word, I hope I don't fall through the glass, right? So effectively, what's happening there is that Glenda would say that the belief that this bridge is stable is being interrupted by this A-leaf, right, which is this automatic kind of attitude or mental state which says glass breaks, caution, collapse, right? Which effectively ends up influencing the way you act going forward, right? So it makes you way more anxious, it distresses you, it ends up making you shake and so forth, right? But also we won't say that the A-leaf, what's happening there is you're doubting whether you should step on or not. Because if you doubt, then you probably wouldn't step on at all, right? So you'll be like, okay, if I even think that there's a crack, why would I even dare step on, right? So we like to think that A-leaves are something different from doubting as well. Sorry, I'm taking a bit of time, but sorry. But effectively, what we need to know is A-leaves are different in content to beliefs, right? So beliefs obviously involve, in this case, involving stable bridge, go ahead, right? And then the A-leaf is glass breaks, don't get on, whatever. And also we see that A-leaves tend to be belief discordant. They tend to go against beliefs, right? So again, the belief is like, this is safe. A-leaf already in this instance says, this is not safe. But nonetheless, you walk because your belief somewhat is stronger in guiding your action effectively, okay? Again, A-leaves are associative, automatic, irrational, right? They're not governed by any process of reasoning. They're associative in the sense that you tend to see something or experience something that already induces those things automatically, right? They're also affect laden in the sense that they impact, they either impact how you feel, they might end up giving you anxiety, right? And they're action generating in the sense that when you start like shaking, right, as opposed to just walking straight, already they influence the action in some way. They're also occurrent or habitual, so they can come in flashes over time, or they can be things that always happen to you. A-leaves, importantly, are reality insensitive, where beliefs are reality sensitive, right? So beliefs are sensitive to the evidence that you have in front of you, right? That's what we think beliefs are, I hope. But A-leaves are reality insensitive, so they somewhat don't really, they don't tend to accord with how things actually are, effectively, right? And also, an A-leaf does not involve you accepting whatever state you feel when you have an A-leaf. So you don't have to accept that the glass will break, right? That kind of thought coming into your mind is enough to adjust your actions or behavior, right? I'll just stop with this slide, but effectively, how does A-leaves go? How can we understand impostorism as an A-leaf, right? So I think that, again, we can cast A, the agent, as ordinarily believing that they are competent and having general evidence that affirms this, okay? So I think that someone can clearly believe that they're competent, but often encounter acute affective attitudinal states, right, to the contrary, which they do not take to be true. It's possible for you to experience something acutely which you wouldn't ordinarily take to be true, which you don't even take to be true in that moment, okay? Also, imposter attitudes to me are reality insensitive, right? In the sense that they tend to be induced by something that after reflection you'll see don't actually reflect your own ability. They don't reflect your abilities, right? I can explain that a bit more. I'm just running for time. I'm so sorry, everyone. But also, we can think that certain experiences, like experiencing challenges in the workplace, or struggling to finish your thesis, like some of us, right? Or stereotype threats and so forth, or discrimination, epistemic injustice, so to speak, right? Can also induce imposter attitudes in an individual, right? But they can induce them in an A-leaf form. Mostly because I don't have to believe what is a product of imposter, or rather of epistemic injustice against me. I don't have to believe what those people would think about me or whatever, right? But nonetheless, it will influence my actions negatively, right? So I think an A-leaf account can also explain how an agent is able to effectively bounce back to being confident, right, in their abilities, or even continue working through these feelings of impostorism, right? Why? Because maybe the individual is, on the whole, more sensitive to being guided by their beliefs, right? We might say that A-leaves, because they're so momentary, right, they can be overcome effectively, right? So we're able to, I think, explain a little bit better why people are able to move past these beliefs. Yeah. So I think I'll stop there. If you're interested in the intrusive thoughts account, we can talk about